But support for Ukraine is weakening.
In the end, all their efforts came to nothing.
That the government and its people have to wait and have to hope for more American aid.
Once the hottest story in the news, the Russia-Ukraine war has now faded into the background amidst the ongoing conflict in Gaza. The war in Ukraine has been dragging on for years with no end in sight. However, recent developments have shown that the U.S. and Europe have finally come to the realization that there's no way for Ukraine to win this war. With the Ukraine stalemate continuing, it begs the question of what this means for Ukraine. What are the implications of this realization, and what does the future hold for Ukraine? Join us as we explain how the war in Ukraine is now basically over. In the last 2 years, the U.S. government has been pouring massive amounts of money and weapons into Ukraine, hoping to tip the balance of the war against Russia. The U.S. has spent hundreds of billions of dollars on military aid, depleting its own ammunition reserves to arm the Ukrainian forces, and rallied every Western ally to impose sanctions on Russia. The Western media has been echoing the U.S. narrative, claiming that Ukraine is winning, Putin is losing, the Russian economy is on the brink of collapse. However, this is far from the truth. In reality, the U.S.-led sanctions have failed to isolate Russia. The Russian economy has bounced back, and Russia has shown no signs of backing down from the war. One of the reasons why the sanctions have failed is that most of the world has refused to join them. Out of the 193 UN member states, only 28 have imposed sanctions on Russia. The rest of the world, including major powers like India, China, Brazil, and South Africa, have maintained or even increased their trade and cooperation with Russia. Why? Because sanctions are ineffective and counterproductive, and Russia is a vital partner for many countries, especially in the energy sector. For example, India used to import less than 3% of its crude oil from Russia before the war. Now, India buys more than 40% of its crude oil from Russia, making it one of the largest customers of Russian oil. Even the U.S., the main instigator of the sanctions, is still doing business with Russia behind the scenes. According to the New York Times, American companies are paying around $1 billion a year to Russia's state-owned nuclear agency to buy the fuel that powers more than half of the U.S.'s emissions-free energy. Another reason why the sanctions have failed is that the Russian economy has recovered from the initial shock of the war. The Russian ruble, which had plummeted in 2022, has regained its pre-war value against the dollar. The Russian government has also taken measures to reduce its dependence on oil and gas exports, diversify its economy, and increase its domestic production and consumption. Most importantly, Russia has prepared itself for a long-term war, both militarily and politically. Russia has mobilized its vast resources and manpower, deploying its advanced weapons and technology, and secured its strategic position and allies in the region. Russia has also maintained its popular support and legitimacy at home, despite Western propaganda and pressure. In contrast, the U.S. and its allies have been facing increasing challenges and difficulties in sustaining their intervention in Ukraine. The U.S. has been struggling to replenish its ammunition stocks, which have been severely depleted by the war. The U.S. has also been facing criticism and opposition from its own Republican Congress, who are questioning the legality and morality of the war. President Zelensky of Ukraine recently made a trip to Washington, D.C., where he appealed to the U.S. Congress for more financial support for his country's war against Russia. He admitted that the conflict was in a deadlock with no progress or resolution in sight. He said that the situation was totally frozen and that he needed more help from the U.S. and its allies. And so, the administration announced that it planned to spend another $1 billion of taxpayers' money in the next year to keep the war going without any clear strategy or objective. Many people are now wondering what the U.S. is trying to achieve in Ukraine. What exactly is the end game for the U.S. involvement? The administration used to talk about victory, but now it seemed to settle for a stalemate. In fact, General Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said that there was no military solution to the war. He implied that the war would drag on indefinitely with no winners or losers. The war in Ukraine had become a question of endurance. Which side could sustain its military force longer? According to an NBC article, one of the main challenges for the U.S. and its allies was the lack of manpower in the Ukrainian army. The U.S. and its allies could supply Ukraine with weapons and equipment, but they could not provide enough trained and motivated soldiers to use them effectively. Ukraine was facing a shortage of manpower to fight against Russia's superior and larger army. Meanwhile, the U.S. and its allies were also distracted by another war in the Middle East, which was escalating every day. Zelensky had to face the harsh reality that he could not count on the U.S. and its allies to save his country from Russia. Israel has always been a more vital ally for the United States than Ukraine. The U.S. had a strategic interest in supporting Ukraine when it was the only major hotspot in the world. The U.S. officials believed that helping Ukraine was a smart move. They thought they could weaken Russia, one of their biggest rivals, without putting any American lives at risk. However, everything changed on October 7th when Israel faced a massive attack from Hamas. Suddenly, Ukraine became irrelevant and forgotten as the world's attention shifted to the Middle East. The Western media stopped covering the war in Ukraine, focused on the crisis in Israel. The public opinion also changed dramatically as a new poll revealed this month. The poll showed that 41% of Americans now think that the U.S. is doing too much to help Ukraine, which is a huge increase from 24% 3 months ago. And so, in a stunning and unexpected twist, U.S. and EU officials have initiated discreet discussions with the Ukrainian government, signaling a shift in strategies and a potential deal with Russia to bring an official end to the war. According to a report by NBC News, these conversations have involved exploring broad outlines of concessions Ukraine might need to make in order to reach a resolution with Russia. The magnitude of this development is exemplified by the striking reversal of Time magazine's perspective. Just last year, they named Zelensky the 2022 Person of the Year, highlighting his leadership during the crisis. However, Time magazine now portrays Zelensky's struggle as a solitary battle. In their article, they reveal Zelensky's feelings of betrayal by his Western allies and quote one of his advisors who candidly remarks, "He deluded himself. We are out of options. We're not winning, but try telling him that." The report by NBC News also suggests that the U.S. and EU officials are concerned about the escalating tensions between Russia and NATO, which have reached a dangerous level in recent months. The officials fear that a miscalculation or a provocation could trigger a wider conflict that would be catastrophic for both sides. Therefore, they are willing to consider a compromise that would grant Russia some degree of influence over eastern Ukraine while preserving Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. However, such a compromise would face strong opposition from Zelensky and his supporters who have vowed to never surrender to Russian aggression. Zelensky has repeatedly called for more military and economic assistance from the West, as well as a clear path to NATO membership for Ukraine. The U.S. and EU are now pressuring Ukrainian officials to agree to a peace deal that would end the war with Russia and also concede a large part of their country to the Russian-backed separatists. This would be a humiliating outcome for NATO and the U.S., who, at the start of this war, spoke with high confidence and ambition, claiming that they would push the Russians back to their pre-war borders. Now it seems that Ukraine will have to give up at least 20% of its territory, an area half the size of the UK. The Western media will try to spin this story and say that it was not a defeat in Ukraine, but a stalemate. They will highlight the fact that NATO has gained 2 new members, Sweden and Finland, as a result of the war. They will also probably blame Zelensky for his poor leadership and lack of vision and move on from another failed war. However, the truth is that there is a bigger picture behind this war. The war in Ukraine has exposed the weaknesses and limitations of the U.S. and NATO, who could not defeat Russia despite spending hundreds of billions of dollars to support Ukraine. The war in Ukraine has shown the world that the U.S. and NATO are not as powerful and influential as they think they are. The U.S. will never acknowledge its failure in Ukraine, and instead, it is already looking for its next target. Even though the U.S. is already involved in 2 wars, in Ukraine and Israel, some Republicans think that this is not enough and now want to challenge China over Taiwan. But before they do that, they should ask themselves a simple question. If the U.S. cannot stop Russia, which has an economy that is only 10% of China's, how can the U.S. possibly think that it can compete with or even contain China in a new war? The people of Taiwan would be wise to consider their future carefully, especially with the upcoming 2024 presidential elections. Joe Biden has promised that the U.S. would defend Taiwan militarily if China invaded, but the U.S. debacle in Ukraine should make every Taiwanese doubt the reliability of this U.S. security guarantee. It is time for the Taiwanese people to elect government officials who can manage the relationship with Beijing peacefully and pragmatically, and not listen to the U.S., who wants to push the island towards independence and use Taiwan as a pawn in a future proxy war against China. The U.S. has paid a high price for its failure in Ukraine, and now people are starting to question the mainstream media's narrative that they have been fed every day and ask simple questions. Why did the U.S. waste billions of dollars on Ukraine with little to show for it while its own economy was crumbling? How would Ukraine be different today if the U.S. had listened to John Meimer, who predicted 6 years ago that pushing Ukraine to join NATO would lead to the destruction of Ukraine? While the U.S. is squandering hundreds of billions of dollars on wars around the world, other superpowers, like China, are also spending hundreds of billions of dollars, but they're doing so on investments that help countries around the world develop and find their place and their voice in this new multipolar war. That is why over 130 countries from around the globe sent representatives to Beijing, China last month to attend China's 10-year anniversary Belt and Road Forum. The BR Forum was a huge success, and it was not a coincidence that at the same time China was hosting this grand event. A new report revealed that the Chinese yuan has officially surpassed the euro to become the world's second most used currency in SWIFT trade settlements. This is a major development and a significant achievement for China's efforts to make its currency more global. 2 decades ago, China was the main trading partner for only a few countries. Today, China is the top trading partner for over 120 countries around the world. China now exports more to the Muslim world, over $42 billion a month, than to the United States, just over $38 billion a month. At the same time, China exports as much to the developing countries as it does to the developed markets. This is the new multipolar world, and with a deadlock in Ukraine and the US and NATO failures, it raises an even bigger question. Does this mean that China is the biggest beneficiary of the US and NATO debacle in Ukraine? What do you think about this? Let us know in the comments section.